Amy Ray stood on the curb at 11:42 p.m. on Christmas Eve, her breath forming uneven clouds in the biting cold. The wind cut straight through her thin coat, clawing at her ribs like it had a personal vendetta. Her blazer bore the faint shadow of a coffee stain she tried to disguise with a scarf that now smelled faintly of stress and cheap detergent. Her boots, long past their prime, squelched quietly as melting snow seeped through cracked seams and soaked her socks. For hours, that was how long the office Christmas party had lasted. For hours of forced smiles, shallow conversations, and couples swaying together beneath twinkling lights, while Amy rearranged the cheese platter for the third time because blending into the background was a skill she had mastered young. Her rideshare app blinked at her in open mockery, spinning, freezing, refusing to load no matter how many times she stabbed at the screen. Urban survival rule number 1. Always check the full license plate. Always confirm the driver photo. Always share your trip. Amy skipped all 3. A sleek black sedan glided to a stop at the curb. Wrong shade of black. Wrong body style compared to the app photo. But 3 of the plate numbers matched, and hypothermia had dulled her instincts into something negotiable, freezing one over caution every time. She yanked the handle. First critical error. The door shut behind her with a soft, final sound. Inside, the air smelled of polished leather and expensive cologne. Clean, sharp, and threaded with something her instincts immediately flagged as dangerous. Wealth. Control. Risk. The driver didn't look back. Dark hair, neatly trimmed. Red shirt stretched across broad shoulders, built for discipline, not desk chairs. His hands gripped the steering wheel with knuckles white from tension. Hi. I'm heading to, Amy began, fumbling for her phone. Seatbelt. Now. The command sliced through the car, low and absolute. Not loud. Not rushed. The kind of voice that wasn't accustomed to being ignored. Her hand froze mid-motion. This was not Marco, the rideshare driver with the friendly smile and the Toyota listed in his profile. Marco listened to true crime podcasts. The irony hit too late. Before she could bolt, all 4 doors locked with a decisive thunk, seals engaging like a vault closing. Her pulse spiked. Their eyes met in the rearview mirror. Bright blue-green. Cold. Assessing. He wasn't startled by her presence. He was evaluating her, like a variable that had just entered an equation he was already solving. You are going nowhere. Second error, not screaming then. The back windshield exploded. Glass burst inward as gunfire tore through the night. Holiday lights from nearby streets streaked into warped ribbons of color. Amy screamed, raw, unfiltered, ripped straight from survival instinct. She dropped to the floorboards, curling tight, clutching her briefcase to her chest as if contracts and legal filings could stop bullets. Get down! Dax barked. What do you think I'm doing? She screamed back, voice shredding as icy air roared through the shattered rear window. The sedan surged forward, acceleration pinning her like a violent amusement ride. More shots cracked. Pinging off panels she now realized were reinforced. They tore through the financial district at speeds that made traffic laws meaningless. Weaving past dark SUVs, she glimpsed only in flashes. Muzzle fire blooming like brief, lethal flowers. Rideshare safety tip number 2. If the car has armor plating, it is not a standard Uber. Who are you people? Amy yelled, hair whipping wildly. Dax, that tells me nothing. Why are they shooting? Enemies. This is attempted homicide, which is why seatbelts matter. Her briefcase flew open during a sharp turn. Legal documents scattered across the blood-red leather seats. Weeks of 12-hour days, her chance at junior partner, now reduced to debris. I have $73 in my bank account, she shouted into the chaos. 0 secrets. Wrong car. Total mistake. Not anymore. His tone was final. At 12:03 a.m., silence fell. They merged onto a dark highway, snowflakes drifting lazily through the headlights. No pursuit. Amy uncurled slowly, glass crunching beneath her palms. Her hand stung as tiny cuts bloomed. One lens of her glasses was cracked. Shock set in, teeth chattering violently. Can I sit up? She asked hoarsely, Or is this still the shootout phase? Sit. She did. Where are we going? Somewhere safe. Your car just got shot. Our car, he corrected, eyes steady in the mirror. You entered voluntarily. Witnesses saw. You are tied to me now. The city lights faded. Trees closed in. At 12:22 a.m., massive iron gates parted. Beyond them lay an estate that looked unreal, stone walls blending fortress solidity with modern design. Security lights washed over pristine snow. Christmas lights traced rooflines and wrapped bare trees, glittering like something out of a dream. This isn't police, Amy whispered. No, not a hospital. No. Dax parked smoothly and turned fully in his seat. His jaw was sharp, his eyes winter pale and unwavering. This is home. The moment Amy Ray stepped inside the house, warmth hit her with such sudden force that her glasses fogged instantly, her breath stuttering as the cold that had gnawed at her bones was replaced by thick, enveloping heat that smelled faintly of pine, citrus, and something richer beneath it, like polished wood and old money. For a dizzying second, the contrast made her sway, and she had to reach out instinctively to steady herself, her boots squeaking obscenely against marble floors so smooth and expansive they reflected the towering chandelier above like a frozen constellation. The foyer dwarfed her in every possible way. Pale stones stretched outward in all directions, interrupted only by sweeping staircases and carefully placed sculptures that looked as though they belonged in museums rather than someone's private residence, while a Christmas tree, so tall it nearly brushed the ceiling, dominated the center of the space, its ornaments unmistakably heirloom pieces rather than the disposable decorations she was used to seeing in storefronts. Every surface gleamed, immaculate and deliberate, as if chaos was not something that existed within these walls. Behind her, the door shut with a sound that felt far too definitive. Amy swallowed hard and turned slowly, her heart still pounding from the chase, from the gunfire, from the sickening realization that whatever mistake she had made could not be undone simply by explaining herself. Dax stood a few steps away, removing his coat with unhurried precision, the red shirt beneath it catching the light in a way that drew her eye despite herself, while two guards materialized at either side of the entrance, so quietly that she wondered how long they had already been there. "This is not a police facility," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady even as her pulse hammered in her ears. "No," Dax replied evenly, folding the coat over his arm as though they had arrived home from an ordinary dinner rather than a firefight. "And not a hospital," she added, because acknowledging the absence of both somehow made the reality sharper. "No," she exhaled, the sound thin and uneven. "Then I am being held here." Dax finally looked at her fully, his gaze steady and unflinching, and although his expression did not soften, there was something deliberate in the way he assessed her, as if he were cataloging her state rather than threatening her outright. "You are a guest," he said, and then, after a brief pause that carried more weight than the words themselves, "for now." Before she could respond, a voice rang out from deeper within the house, bright and unmistakably delighted. "He is back." The sound of hurried footsteps followed, light and quick, and moments later a woman swept into the foyer with a kind of confidence that suggested she belonged to the space, so completely that the walls themselves had adjusted around her. She was elegant in a way that did not feel performative, her cream-colored dress tailored perfectly to her frame, dark hair pinned back with effortless precision, and when her eyes landed on Amy, they widened with undisguised interest. "Oh!" the woman breathed, clasping her hands together. "She is beautiful." "Mother!" Dax said sharply, warning threaded through the single word. But the woman ignored him entirely as she crossed the distance between herself and Amy in long, purposeful strides, stopping just short of invading her space, though the scrutiny that followed was no less intense. Her gaze moved from Amy's damp boots to the coffee-stained blazer, to the tiny cuts on her hands and the faint tremor she had yet to fully control, and something like concern flickered briefly across her features. "You are freezing," she said decisively, "and bleeding." "Dax, explain." "It was an incident," he replied, his tone clipped. Her mouth tightened. "An incident does not explain bullet holes." Amy opened her mouth to interject, because if anyone was going to clarify that she had not planned to end up here, it would have to be her, but the woman was already taking her arm, her grip firm yet oddly comforting as she guided her toward the dining room with surprising strength. "Sit," she instructed, steering her into a chair at a long table that seemed designed to accommodate an entire army. "We will address misunderstandings after you eat." "I don't think food is the priority," Amy protested weakly, even as her stomach betrayed her with a painful twist. "Nonsense," the woman replied briskly. "Food is always the priority." Platters covered the table in such abundance that Amy's brain struggled to process it all at once, from roasted turkey carved to perfection, to glazed ham shimmering beneath honeyed sauce, to bowls of vegetables prepared in ways she did not recognize but immediately wanted to taste. The air was thick with warmth and scent, and despite herself, her body responded, hunger cutting through fear with humiliating efficiency. "I am Veda Lane," the woman said, arranging food onto a plate with practiced ease. "And you are Amy Ray." "Amy froze. You know my name?" "Of course," Veda replied lightly. "Plates, apps, public records. Standard protocol." "And if I refuse to stay?" Amy asked carefully, watching Dax from the corner of her eye. Veda paused, then smiled in a way that was not unkind, but was unmistakably final. "My son prefers cooperation." Dax did not contradict her. Amy sank into the chair, exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders as the adrenaline finally began to ebb, leaving behind the hollow ache of shock. She answered questions automatically as Veda piled food onto her plate, explaining that she was a junior associate at Hartwell Associates, that she worked in corporate law, that she had attended an office party and only wanted to go home, and each detail seemed to amuse or intrigue the woman more than the last. "A lawyer," Veda said with approval. "Perfect. We need intelligent minds in this family." "I work contracts," Amy said quickly. "Not criminal matters." Veda waved a dismissive hand. "Everything is negotiable." The casual way she said it made something twist in Amy's stomach. When the meal ended, she was led through a labyrinth of hallways that only reinforced the sense that she had stepped into a world operating by entirely different rules, where cameras were integrated so seamlessly into the architecture that they were almost invisible, and guards stood watch with polite neutrality that did nothing to disguise their readiness. Her room, when she reached it, was larger than her entire apartment, complete with plush furnishings, heavy curtains, and a bathroom stocked with first aid supplies as though injury was not an unusual occurrence here. It was only after she sank onto the edge of the bed, boots discarded and head spinning, that she noticed she was not alone. "You handled dinner better than most," a voice said casually. Amy spun around, heart leaping, to find a young man lounging near the window, his posture relaxed to the point of irreverence, dark hair perpetually tousled, hoodie and jeans looking wildly out of place amid the opulence. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Rune," he replied cheerfully. "Dax's cousin. And before you ask, yes, everyone knows you're here, and no, you're not the strangest thing that's happened this Christmas." She stared at him, incredulous. "I was shot at." "Low-ranking excitement," he said lightly, then sobered. "But you should understand something, Amy, because no one else is going to spell it out for you. Once people see you enter with Dax, you acquire value, and value requires containment." "I am not an asset," she snapped. "Here, visibility equals leverage," Rune replied calmly. "No harm intended, but no exit either." Sleep came poorly that night, tangled with half-formed plans and the persistent awareness of being watched, and when morning arrived, it did so with deceptive normalcy, sunlight spilling through tall windows, a tray of breakfast waiting outside her door with a handwritten note from Veda, as if she were a welcomed guest rather than an unwilling participant. By the time she reached the garden later that afternoon, her ankle throbbed and her resolve had hardened, because no amount of luxury could erase the reality that she had been trapped by circumstance, and when she made her attempt to escape, driven by desperation rather than strategy, the fall that followed was swift and unforgiving. Pain exploded up her leg, sharp and blinding, and before she could even scream, a familiar voice cut through the cold air above her. "Ms. Ray." The voice was calm, level, and completely devoid of surprise, which somehow made it worse. Amy squeezed her eyes shut for a moment before forcing herself to look up, her jaw clenched so tightly her teeth ached. Dax stood at the top of the wall, hands tucked casually into the pockets of his black coat, posture relaxed in a way that suggested he had been waiting for this exact outcome rather than discovering it. Behind him, 3 guards lingered at a respectful distance, their expressions carefully neutral, though she could feel the weight of their attention pressing down on her like a physical force. "You followed me," she accused, though her voice shook despite her best effort to keep it steady. "I anticipated you," he corrected mildly, stepping closer to the edge so that his face came fully into view. His eyes moved over her with clinical precision, cataloging dirt-streaked clothes, scraped hands, and finally the way she was holding her leg at an unnatural angle. "And you are injured." "I'm fine," she snapped automatically because denial was easier than acknowledging how badly it hurt. "Stand," he said. She tried. The instant her weight shifted, agony lanced through her ankle, hot and immediate, and the sound that tore from her throat was humiliating in its rawness as her knee buckled, and she collapsed back into the snow, vision blurring. Dax swore under his breath, a sharp sound that seemed out of place against his otherwise controlled demeanor, and in the next moment he was no longer above her but beside her, having vaulted the wall with effortless grace that made her stomach twist. He crouched in front of her, one gloved hand already hovering near her ankle, though he did not touch her yet, as if waiting for permission he was not accustomed to seeking. "You are not fine," he said quietly. "Don't," she warned, her hands curling into fists at her sides as she tried to push herself backward. "Don't touch me." He paused, then slowly withdrew his hand, though his gaze never left her face. "You attempted escape with a compromised plan," he said evenly. "You slipped because you underestimated the ice and overestimated your strength." "Thank you for the analysis," she shot back, anger flaring hot enough to momentarily dull the pain. "Next time I'll bring a grappling hook." "There will not be a next time," he replied without inflection. Her laugh came out sharp and hysterical. "You can't just decide that." "I can," he said simply, and then, without further warning, he reached down and lifted her. Amy gasped as the ground disappeared beneath her, instinctively grabbing at his coat as he scooped her up with one arm under her knees and the other braced securely behind her back. The motion was so smooth, so unstrained, that it robbed her of the breath she needed to protest, and by the time her mind caught up, she was already pressed against his chest, the steady thud of his heartbeat impossible to ignore. "Put me down," she demanded, though the words came out weaker than she intended. "No, this is kidnapping," she insisted, even as she clung to him to keep from falling again. "This is transport," he countered, already walking back toward the house. "Your injury requires treatment." "I did not consent." "You consented when you entered my car," he said, his tone unchanged. She went very still at that, her fingers tightening against the fabric of his coat as fury and fear tangled together in her chest. "I made a mistake," she said fiercely. "That doesn't mean you own me." His steps did not falter, but something shifted in his expression, darkening his gaze as he looked down at her. "Here," he said quietly, "mistakes have consequences." The house loomed closer with every step, its lights glowing warmly against encroaching dusk, and Amy hated how relieved her body felt at the promise of heat and shelter, even as her mind screamed that this was not safety, merely containment disguised as comfort. Guards fell into step alongside them without comment, opening doors before Dax reached them, their efficiency reinforcing the reality that resistance here was not something anyone expected to encounter often. He carried her through the conservatory and into a quieter wing of the house, where the noise of distant conversation faded into silence, and then into an office that radiated controlled power, from the heavy wooden desk positioned to command the room to the shelves lined with books whose titles hinted at commerce, strategy, and histories written by those who had won. He set her down gently on a leather couch, his hands lingering only long enough to ensure she was steady before stepping back. "Stay," he instructed. "I wasn't planning on running on one foot," she muttered, though the edge of panic in her voice betrayed her. Without responding, he disappeared briefly into an adjoining room, and Amy took the opportunity to look around, cataloging exits, windows, and camera placements out of sheer habit, though she knew instinctively that nothing in this space existed without intention. When he returned, he carried a small basin of warm water, a first aid kit that looked far more professional than she expected, and a glass jar containing a greenish salve that smelled faintly of herbs. "What is that?" she asked warily. "Arnica and comfrey," he replied, kneeling in front of her. Calendula. It reduces swelling and prevents infection. You sound very confident for someone who shoots people for a living, she remarked. One does not survive long without learning how to repair damage, he said, then glanced up at her. Remove your boot. She hesitated, then complied, biting back a hiss as the pressure eased and the swelling became impossible to ignore. The sight of her ankle, already darkening with bruises, made her stomach drop. Sprain, he said, his voice matter-of-fact. Severe. I need to go home, she insisted, though the words felt increasingly hollow. You cannot, he replied simply, and then, before she could argue further, he began to clean the scrapes on her hands with surprising gentleness, his touch careful and precise in a way that did not align with the violence she had witnessed earlier. The contrast unsettled her more than roughness would have, because it suggested intention rather than impulse. As he worked, she watched him in silence, taking in the faint scar along his jaw, the concentration etched into his features, and the way his hands, so capable of inflicting harm, moved with quiet competence now. When he applied the salve, the cool relief made her gasp softly, and his gaze flicked up to her face, something unreadable passing between them. You were always going to try, he said after a moment, wrapping her ankle securely. Rune warned me. Rune warned you, she repeated, disbelief threading through her exhaustion. So this was a test. A precaution, he corrected. I needed to know how far you would go. And now you do, she shot back. Congratulations. He stood, wiping his hands, his expression closing off once more. Rest, he instructed. Petra will bring you food. We will discuss this later. Later never sounded good in anyone's vocabulary. Left alone again. Amy stared at the ceiling as pain dulled into a persistent throb and the weight of her situation settled heavily over her, pressing in from all sides. Every path she could imagine led back to the same conclusion. She was contained not through bars or threats, but through layers of control so seamlessly integrated into the environment that resistance felt almost childish. When Rune appeared later with an apologetic shrug and a running commentary on security protocols delivered with unsettling cheer, it only confirmed what she already suspected, that this place was designed to anticipate failure and neutralize it long before it became a threat. By the time evening approached and Petra delivered dinner along with an unspoken warning look, Amy's anger had cooled into something more dangerous, a quiet resolve that demanded strategy rather than impulse. The dress arrived shortly after, draped across the bed in a bold red that made her chest tighten, its elegance unmistakable and entirely inappropriate for someone who had arrived here bleeding and afraid. She stared at it for a long time, weighing defiance against pragmatism before finally conceding that compliance, for now, might buy her more than resistance ever would. Dinner at the Lane estate did not begin with an announcement so much as an inevitable shift in gravity, because the house itself seemed to lean toward the long family room as the hour approached, lights warming, voices gathering, and staff moving with quiet precision that made it clear this ritual had been refined over decades. By the time Amy reached the threshold, supported discreetly by a guard who pretended not to notice her limp, the room had already transformed into something both inviting and unnerving, its polished wood surfaces reflecting candlelight, and its long table dressed with linen so immaculate it bordered on ceremonial. Veda Lane presided at the center with the ease of someone born into command, yet softened by hospitality, her cream dress catching the light as she moved among place settings, adjusting a fork here, a glass there, as though control expressed itself best through care. When she spotted Amy, her face brightened immediately, relief and delight threading together in a way that made resistance feel almost impolite. There you are, Veda said warmly, crossing the room with quick, graceful steps. I was worried you might be in pain. I'm managing, Amy replied, because honesty felt dangerous and weakness felt worse. Nonsense, Veda dismissed gently, already ushering her toward a chair placed conspicuously near the center of the table. You're a guest in this house, and guests are looked after. The word guest landed strangely, considering the guard stationed at each entrance and the knowledge that her every movement was monitored. But Amy allowed herself to be seated, if only because standing for too long was no longer an option. As she settled in, she became acutely aware of the way the room's attention oriented subtly around her arrival, glances flicking her way before retreating behind polite expressions that barely masked curiosity. Dax entered moments later, his presence changing the atmosphere without any overt display, the conversations quieting just enough to acknowledge the shift. He moved to the seat beside her with unhurried confidence. The red shirt he wore earlier replaced by a darker jacket that sharpened his silhouette and reinforced the sense that he belonged at the head of any table he occupied. When he sat, the chair angled just enough to allow his arm to rest behind hers, not touching, yet unmistakably present. "You're limping," he observed quietly. "I fell," she replied just as quietly, refusing to meet his gaze. "On a wall," he added, as if noting the weather. Veda's eyes narrowed slightly. "A wall?" "A misunderstanding," Dax said smoothly. Amy bit down on a retort, because the last thing she needed was to provoke a debate about attempted escapes in front of people she did not yet understand. Instead, she focused on the table as dishes began to arrive in a steady procession, the food presented with a care that bordered on reverence, from perfectly roasted turkey to vegetables arranged with deliberate artistry. Each plate a reminder of abundance and permanence. Introductions followed, unfolding with the same practice cadence as the meal itself. Cade Lane, Dax's older brother, observed her with a sharp, analytical gaze that suggested a man who measured people as assets or threats long before he bothered learning their preferences, while Thea, his wife, offered a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes, her pearls catching the light as she inclined her head in greeting. Rune appeared at the far end of the table, his casual grin barely concealing his interest, though Amy suspected he was cataloging reactions rather than indulging curiosity. Conversation flowed easily around her at first, anecdotes and family commentary filling the space as though nothing were out of the ordinary. Yet Amy noticed how often eyes returned to her, how questions were angled just enough to draw her in without cornering her outright. When Veda asked about her work, the shift was immediate, the table's attention sharpening as Amy explained her role in corporate law, the mergers and acquisitions that consumed her days, and the precision required to navigate negotiations where every word carried consequence. "A lawyer," Cade repeated thoughtfully, his gaze assessing. "That explains the composure." "She screamed in the car," Rune added helpfully. "Rune," Veda warned. "I screamed too," Amy interjected dryly, earning a ripple of laughter that surprised her with its warmth. Dax watched her closely as the exchange unfolded, something unreadable passing through his eyes as she found herself engaging despite her better judgment, answering questions with a candor that felt almost rebellious in its normalcy. It was easier, she realized, to be herself than to maintain the constant tension of resistance, even if the ease felt like a trap. As the meal progressed, the boundaries between captor and captive blurred uncomfortably, not because they ceased to exist, but because they were obscured by ritual and routine, by the insistence that this was simply a family gathered for dinner rather than a power structure asserting itself through civility. When Amy laughed at one of Rune's offhand remarks, she felt Dax's hand settle briefly against her knee, a steadying presence that could have been interpreted as concern if she did not know better. "Careful," he murmured. "Your ankle." "I'm aware," she replied, her breath catching despite herself. The touch lingered only a moment before withdrawing, but the awareness it left behind refused to dissipate, a reminder that proximity here was never accidental. Thea noticed, Amy was sure of it, her gaze flicking between them with subtle calculation, as though already drawing conclusions. By the time dessert arrived, Amy's exhaustion pressed heavily against her composure, the weight of the day settling into her bones alongside the realization that she had survived something extraordinary only to find herself navigating something far more complex. When the meal finally drew to a close, Veda rose and clapped her hands softly, signaling an end that felt both merciful and ominous. "You should rest," she said kindly, pressing a hand to Amy's shoulder. "Tomorrow will bring clarity." The word clarity echoed as Amy was escorted back through the quiet halls, her thoughts churning with questions that refused to resolve. Dax accompanied her partway, his presence a silent assertion that the evening's civility did not negate the underlying truth of her situation. At her door he paused, his expression softer than she expected, though no less intense. "You did well tonight," he said. "That wasn't a test," she replied, meeting his gaze. "It always is," he answered, and with that he turned away, leaving her alone with the unsettling knowledge that survival here depended not only on strength or defiance, but on understanding the currents beneath the surface. As the door closed behind her, Amy leaned against it, the quiet pressing in, and wondered whether adaptation would prove more dangerous than resistance, because in a place where kindness and control were so intricately intertwined, the line between safety and surrender was perilously thin. Morning arrived at the Lane estate without apology, because the house did not believe in easing anyone into reality, and when Amy Ray opened her eyes, the light pouring through the tall windows was already sharp enough to make the glass glitter. For a few disoriented seconds, she lay still, suspended between the familiar panic of waking late for work and the unfamiliar awareness that work, as she knew it, had been temporarily erased from her life. The ceiling above her was too high, the air too warm, and the silence too deliberate, and it was only when she shifted slightly and pain flared in her ankle that memory snapped fully into place. The car, the gunfire, the wall, the dinner. She exhaled slowly, pressing the heel of her hand into her eyes, as if that might push the previous night back into something manageable, though she already knew it would not. When she swung her legs carefully over the side of the bed, the room seemed to observe her in return, cameras invisible but implied, the soft hum of climate control reinforcing the sense that nothing here existed without oversight. A tray sat outside her door when she opened it, arranged with the precision of a peace offering rather than a casual courtesy. Coffee steamed gently, its aroma rich and grounding, and beside it lay croissants still warm to the touch, accompanied by a small card written in looping script. "Good morning, darling. Brunch at 11. Rest first. V." Amy stared at the note for a long moment, then set it aside with a huff of disbelief, because if there was one thing she did not need right now, it was maternal affection from the matriarch of the family that had effectively detained her. Nevertheless, hunger proved more persuasive than principle, and she ate standing by the window, watching guards trace their routes through the snow-dusted grounds below with mechanical consistency. After she showered, navigating the expansive bathroom with cautious movements and a growing appreciation for the luxury she had not earned, she dressed in clothes that had appeared in her closet overnight, the fit precise enough to unsettle her further. Someone here knew her size, her proportions, and her preferences well enough to anticipate them, and the thought followed her as she ventured into the hall, supported by a polite nod from the guard stationed nearby. The estate was quieter in daylight, though no less imposing, and as she made her way toward the kitchen, she began to notice the subtle rhythms of the house, the way staff moved with purpose but without haste, the way doors opened before anyone reached for them, and the way every corridor seemed to curve gently back toward the center, discouraging wandering without ever explicitly forbidding it. Petra was already there when Amy arrived, humming softly as she arranged ingredients on a marble island, her presence immediately grounding in its ordinariness. She looked up with a knowing smile that carried none of the scrutiny Amy had grown accustomed to. "You should keep weight off that ankle today," Petra said gently. "Ice helps." "Ice helps with many things," Amy replied, grateful for the simplicity of the exchange. Petra inclined her head, as if acknowledging the layers beneath the comment, and gestured toward a stool. "Brunch later. For now, tea." As Amy settled in, sipping slowly and letting warmth seep back into her, she considered her options with the methodical detachment that had served her well in conference rooms and negotiations. Panic was unproductive, impulse dangerous, and overt defiance here had already proven costly. If she was to regain any semblance of control, she would need information, leverage, and time, and as she finished her tea, she resolved to collect all three. By late morning, the family room buzzed with a curated version of activity, the space transformed once again by Veda's attention, though the atmosphere was noticeably less formal than the previous evening. When Amy arrived, assisted discreetly by a guard who maintained a respectful distance, Veda greeted her with genuine warmth, guiding her toward a seat with practiced ease. "You slept," Veda observed approvingly. "Good. Clarity comes with rest." "So I've been told," Amy replied, and something about her tone seemed to amuse the older woman. Brunch unfolded with a lighter cadence than dinner, conversation meandering through safer topics, the sharp edges of the previous night softened by daylight and routine. Dax joined them partway through, fresh from the gym if the faint sheen on his skin and the loosened set of his posture were any indication, and when his gaze landed on Amy, it lingered just long enough to make her acutely aware of her own presence. "You should not be on your feet," he said quietly, taking the seat across from her. "I'm sitting," she replied, then added, because it felt important, and thinking. Dangerous combination, Rune remarked from his place at the counter. Amy shot him a look, then turned her attention back to Dax, because avoidance had never served her well. You said I'm a guest, she began carefully. Guests leave. Dax regarded her in silence for a moment, as though weighing how much honesty was prudent before responding. Guests who are seen entering my car during an active conflict do not, he said evenly. Not immediately. And how long is not immediately? She pressed, keeping her voice level. As long as it takes to neutralize the risk, he replied. To you, she clarified. To you as well, he countered. They would use you to reach me. The bluntness of the statement settled heavily between them, and Amy fought the urge to dismiss it outright, because instinct told her he was not exaggerating. So I'm collateral, she said quietly. You are leverage, he corrected, and then, at her sharp inhale, added, and responsibility. That word caught her off guard, its implication far more complex than threat or possession, and she found herself studying him anew, searching for signs of deceit or calculation. If he noticed her scrutiny, he gave no indication, instead turning his attention back to the table as though the conversation had concluded. It had not. Later that afternoon, as the estate slipped into its quieter rhythms once more, Rune found her in the sitting room with a tablet she had been allowed to borrow, her ankle elevated and her expression intent as she reviewed security footage maps with the practiced eye of someone used to reading systems for weaknesses. You're adapting, Rune observed lightly, leaning against the doorframe. I prefer strategizing, she replied without looking up. Semantics, he said, though there was a note of respect in his voice. Dax notices. That's unfortunate. Not necessarily, Rune replied, pushing off the frame and crossing the room. He respects competence. And compliance, she added pointedly. And boundaries, Rune said after a pause. You just haven't learned where his are yet. The comment lingered as he left her to her thoughts, and by the time evening approached, Amy's frustration had coalesced into something sharper, more deliberate. She requested a meeting not because she expected immediate freedom, but because silence was a concession she was no longer willing to make. Dax received her in his office just after sunset, the room bathed in amber light that softened its edges without diminishing its authority. He gestured for her to sit, and she did, keeping her posture upright despite the ache in her ankle and the tension curling in her spine. You wanted to talk, he said. I want terms, she replied plainly. If I'm staying, then it won't be in a vacuum. He studied her for a long moment, and she held his gaze without flinching, because she knew the value of that alone. Go on. I want access to communication, she continued, choosing each word with care. Limited, monitored if you insist, but I need to notify my firm and my family. I want clarity on what I can and cannot do, and I want my autonomy respected within those limits. Silence stretched between them, thick with calculation, and when he finally responded, his tone was measured rather than dismissive. You ask for concessions, he said. Why should I grant them? Because containment without consent breeds resistance, she replied evenly. And resistance escalates risk. Something like approval flickered across his expression before he masked it, and when he nodded, it felt less like a victory than an opening. You will have supervised access, he agreed, and parameters. In return, you do not test my security again. For now, she said. For now, he echoed. As she left the office, Amy was acutely aware that she had not escaped her situation so much as reframed it, trading open defiance for negotiated coexistence, and the realization was both empowering and unsettling. She had entered the wrong car by accident, but what followed was no longer accidental, and as the estate settled into night once more, she wondered how long she could maintain the balance she had begun to construct. If the Lane estate had a rhythm, Amy Ray began to hear it only after she stopped fighting every note, because resistance had sharpened her senses without teaching her the pattern, whereas observation, quiet and deliberate, finally allowed the structure beneath the surface to reveal itself. Mornings arrived early and without indulgence, not because anyone enforced them upon her directly, but because the house itself woke with purpose, corridors filling with low voices, distant footfalls, and the faint hum of systems recalibrating for another day of operation. From her window, She could see guards rotate positions with mechanical consistency, their movements overlapping like gears, while cameras pivoted in slow, deliberate arcs that never felt hurried, yet never missed anything of consequence. Her ankle improved steadily under Petra's watchful care, the swelling receding in predictable stages, pain dulling into an ache that no longer dominated her thoughts, and as mobility returned, so did her awareness of how carefully freedom here was rationed. She could walk the gardens, but never alone, and she could explore interior spaces, but always within an invisible boundary she learned to sense before she tested it. The absence of explicit prohibitions unsettled her more than locked doors would have, because it meant compliance was expected, not coerced, and expectation carried a weight of its own. Dax's presence threaded through her days with similar subtlety, sometimes distant enough to feel theoretical, other times close enough to make her acutely aware of the space he occupied, both physically and psychologically. He did not hover, nor did he withdraw completely, and the balance he maintained suggested intention rather than indecision. She saw him in the mornings returning from the gym, posture loose with exertion, towel slung over his shoulder, and she saw him in the evenings, suit jacket discarded, sleeves rolled back as he spoke quietly with Cade or took calls that ended in clipped affirmations. He did not explain himself, yet explanation seemed unnecessary in a place where roles were assumed rather than assigned. What unsettled her most was not the control he exerted, but the moments when he chose not to, because those silences invited interpretation, and interpretation had a way of exposing fault lines she had spent years concealing. She found herself watching him without meaning to, noting the way he listened more than he spoke, how his attention sharpened when conversations shifted toward strategy or threat, and how his expression softened imperceptibly in moments he likely assumed went unnoticed. There was restraint in him, hard-won and deliberate, and recognizing it complicated her anger in ways she did not welcome. Rune, ever-present and irreverent, seemed to delight in pointing out these complications, offering commentary that skirted the edge of propriety without quite crossing it. He appeared one afternoon as Amy sat in the sunroom with a stack of documents Dax had casually allowed her to review, the implication of trust embedded in the gesture too significant to ignore. "You're being folded in," Rune observed lightly, leaning against the doorway. "That's new." "I'm being occupied," Amy replied, though she did not look up from the annotated pages spread before her. "Same thing here," he countered cheerfully. "Idle assets become liabilities." She closed the folder with more force than necessary. "I'm not an asset." Rune's grin softened into something more thoughtful. "No," he agreed, "but you are interesting, and interest drives behavior." The comment lingered long after he left, settling into the quiet spaces of her mind as she continued to navigate a life that bore little resemblance to the one she had known, yet demanded many of the same skills. Negotiation, observation, timing, and restraint were not new to her, and she realized with a mix of irritation and pride that she was well equipped for survival here, perhaps more so than she wanted to admit. It was during one of the evening walks, her ankle nearly healed and her pace steady once more, that the fault lines finally surfaced in a way neither of them could ignore. The gardens were subdued under twilight, pathways illuminated just enough to suggest safety without sacrificing shadow, and Dax walked beside her with an ease that suggested this was not a concession, but a choice. They spoke little at first, the silence between them companionable rather than strained, until Amy, emboldened by the quiet, broke it. "You don't sleep much," she said, glancing at him sideways. He considered the statement before responding. "Sleep is inefficient." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're getting," he replied, though the corner of his mouth twitched as if acknowledging the inadequacy of the response. She shook her head. "You plan for everything else. Contingencies, redundancies, risk mitigation. Yet you ignore yourself." His gaze shifted to her, sharper now. "Careful," he said. "You're making assumptions." "I'm making observations," she corrected calmly. "There's a difference." They stopped walking, the path curving away as though intentionally granting them privacy, and for a moment the distance between them felt charged rather than measured. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, stripped of its usual detachment. "You think understanding me gives you leverage." "I think understanding you keeps me alive," she replied without hesitation. The honesty of the statement surprised them both, and in its wake, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, as though a boundary had been crossed not by force, but by clarity. Dax studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, as if acknowledging a truth he had no intention of disputing. "Stay close to me," he said finally. "It reduces variables." She laughed softly, a sound edged with disbelief. "You say that like it's advice, not control." "Sometimes they are the same," he replied. It was later that night, as the house settled into its quieter hours, that Amy found herself unable to sleep, restlessness gnawing at her resolve until she abandoned the bed in favor of the kitchen, where dim security lights cast long shadows across polished surfaces. She poured herself a glass of water, her thoughts circling the conversation she could not let go of, when she sensed rather than heard someone behind her. Dax stood near the doorway, his jacket gone, sleeves rolled back, expression unreadable in the low light. "You should be resting," he said. "So should you," she countered, meeting his gaze steadily. He did not argue, which felt like a concession all its own, and instead moved closer, stopping just short of invading her space. The proximity was immediate and overwhelming, his presence filling the room in a way that made it difficult to focus on anything else. "This arrangement," she began carefully, "it can't stay undefined." "It is defined," he replied. "You stay. I protect." "That's not a partnership," she said, frustration threading through her voice. "That's containment." He regarded her for a long moment, then shook his head. "You misunderstand. I don't contain what I value." The words landed with an impact she had not anticipated, her breath catching as she searched his face for irony or manipulation, and found none. The silence stretched, thick with implication, until the distance between them felt both intentional and fragile, as though a single movement could shatter the equilibrium they had maintained. "Dax!" she said quietly, and then stopped, because she did not know how to finish the sentence without revealing more than she was ready to give. He closed the distance then, slowly and deliberately, giving her every opportunity to step away, though she did not. When his hand came up to cup her face, the touch was warm and steady, grounding rather than demanding, and the intimacy of it stole the remaining protests from her lips. The kiss that followed was neither tentative nor reckless, but something in between, charged with restraint and held tension, as though both of them were acutely aware of the consequences and chose to proceed anyway. It was brief, intense, and unmistakably real, and when he pulled back, his eyes were darker than she had ever seen them. "This complicates things," she murmured. "Yes," he agreed, "but complication is inevitable." She stepped away then, because clarity demanded distance, and as she left him standing alone in the kitchen, her heart racing and her thoughts in disarray, she understood with chilling certainty that whatever lines she had drawn to protect herself were already shifting. Sleep never truly arrived for Amy Ray that night, because the quiet that settled over the Lane estate was not the kind that invited rest, but the kind that sharpened awareness and made every thought echo more loudly than it had any right to. The kiss lingered like a bruise beneath her skin, not painful but impossible to ignore, and the knowledge that she had crossed a line she had sworn to herself she would never approach left her restless in a way that no amount of rationalization could soothe. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of systems recalibrating and the faint cadence of patrols moving through the grounds, while her mind replayed the moment in the kitchen again and again, dissecting it for weakness, for manipulation, for anything that might allow her to dismiss it as a mistake. She failed. What unsettled her most was not the desire itself, but the clarity that accompanied it, because she understood too well how vulnerability could be exploited, and yet she could not deny the sense that what had passed between them had been chosen, not coerced. That distinction mattered, even if she did not want it to, and it was precisely because it mattered that she knew she had to leave, because staying now would mean conceding something far more dangerous than her physical freedom. When the clock on her bedside table read 11:37 p.m., she rose quietly, movements deliberate and economical, dressing in dark clothes that blended easily with shadow and slipping on boots that offered traction without noise. Her ankle protested as she put weight on it, a dull ache reminding her of previous failure, but the pain was manageable now, and she welcomed it as proof that she was no longer helpless. She paused briefly at the door, listening for any indication that her movement had been detected, and when nothing followed, she eased into the hallway, the soft carpet swallowing the sound of her steps. The guard stationed at the far end of the corridor had shifted positions, his absence a narrow window she had anticipated but not relied upon. And as she moved through the familiar maze of halls, she kept her breathing steady, her focus sharp, refusing to allow doubt to slow her. She reached the kitchen without incident, the space bathed in low security lighting that left corners deep in shadow, and it was there, standing before the counter where fruit was arranged with meticulous care, that she hesitated. The knife block sat where it always did. She selected a small paring knife, its blade sharp and unassuming, easily concealed in her palm, and for a fleeting second she considered the implications of what she was doing, because this was no longer a panicked reaction, but a calculated decision. She did not intend to hurt anyone. Yet she understood that intent mattered little if events spiraled beyond her control, and the awareness sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cold outside. The conservatory doors yielded silently, the night air rushing in to meet her as she stepped into the garden, the scent of snow and dormant earth grounding her as she moved along the path she had memorized during daylight hours. Floodlights illuminated portions of the grounds in steady arcs, while others remained deliberately obscured, and she navigated the pattern with care, timing her movement to the slow pivot of cameras rather than their static presence. She was halfway to the gate when a voice spoke from the shadows. "Insomnia!" She froze, heart slamming against her ribs, as Rune stepped into view near the fountain, his posture casual but his eyes sharp, hoodie pulled up against the cold. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with unspoken understanding, and then he glanced at her hand, his gaze flicking briefly to the knife she had not yet concealed. "You picked the fruit knife," he observed quietly. "Low intimidation, high utility." "I don't want to hurt anyone," she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. "I know," he said and then sighed. "That's why this won't work." "Help me," she said simply, because honesty had served her better here than pretense. Rune's expression softened, though the humor did not entirely leave his eyes. "The gate requires biometric authorization," he said. "Even if I opened it, the system would flag the breach and summon him before you reach the road." "Then come with me," she countered. "Distract them." He shook his head slowly. "He's already awake." The words settled heavily, and before she could respond, the garden light surged to full intensity, bathing the path in stark white illumination that erased every shadow she had counted on. The sound of approaching footsteps followed, measured and unhurried, and Amy turned just as Dax emerged from the darkness. His coat black against the snow, his expression controlled yet unmistakably tense. Behind him, guards fanned out with practiced efficiency, stopping at a respectful distance that emphasized the fact that he did not require force to command the situation. "Drop the knife, Bambi," Dax said calmly, his gaze fixed on her face rather than the blade in her hand. Her jaw tightened. "Don't call me that." "Then stop acting like a startled deer," he replied evenly, though there was an undercurrent of something sharper beneath the words. "You're injured. You won't make it past the gate." "Let me go," she said, the plea threaded with frustration and fear she could no longer contain. "I didn't choose this." "You chose to run," he countered. "I chose not to stay trapped," she shot back, her grip tightening on the knife as her pulse spiked. "This place is a prison." "No," he said, stepping closer, his movements slow and deliberate, hands open and visible. "This is protection." "From you," she snapped. His gaze flickered briefly, something like hurt crossing his features before it disappeared behind control. "From them," he corrected quietly. "You are safer here than anywhere else." "That doesn't make it right," she insisted, her voice cracking despite her resolve. "You don't get to decide my life because you think you're protecting me." He stopped a few feet away, the space between them charged with everything they had not said. "I get to decide because they would use you to reach me," he said, his tone low and urgent now. "You saw what they're capable of. Staying is not surrender, Amy. It's survival." "And what happens when I start believing you?" she demanded, tears burning hot behind her eyes. "What happens when I stop fighting and let this become normal?" "That's the risk," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "For both of us." The honesty in the admission broke something open in her, the certainty she had clung to fracturing under the weight of it, and before she could stop herself, She let the knife fall into the snow, the sound muffled but definitive. The guards tensed, then relaxed at Dax's subtle gesture, and he closed the remaining distance between them with care, as though approaching a wild animal rather than a threat. She did not pull away when his arms came around her, though her body shook with the release of everything she had been holding back, and when she buried her face against his chest, the warmth and solidity of him grounded her in a way she resented even as she needed it. He did not speak, nor did he tighten his hold, simply standing there with her as the night pressed in around them, the garden lights glaring and indifferent. When she finally stepped back, her eyes red and her expression raw, she looked up at him with fierce clarity. "This doesn't mean I'm staying forever," she said. "I know," he replied. "It means you're staying until it's safe." She nodded once, because she did not trust herself to speak further, and as Rune cleared his throat awkwardly and retreated with a muttered comment about drama levels exceeding acceptable thresholds, Dax signaled for the guards to stand down, the tension dissolving as quickly as it had flared. As they walked back toward the house together, Amy was acutely aware that she had not won her freedom, but she had chosen a different kind of agency, one rooted in awareness rather than denial. The attempt had failed, yet it had also clarified something essential, because lines had been drawn and acknowledged, and the truth, however uncomfortable, had been spoken aloud. The days that followed the failed escape did not announce themselves as different, yet Amy Ray felt the change almost immediately, because the tension that had once sat heavy and unresolved in every corner of the Lane estate began to redistribute itself into something quieter and more deliberate. Nothing overt shifted in terms of rules or visible boundaries, but the atmosphere softened in ways that could not be dismissed as coincidence, as though the house itself had adjusted to accommodate a new understanding that no one felt the need to articulate aloud. Her ankle healed steadily under Petra's careful supervision, the swelling receding until movement no longer required calculation, and with each regained step came a subtle restoration of confidence that did not go unnoticed. Guards still accompanied her when she walked the grounds, yet their presence felt less like surveillance and more like routine, their distance increasing by increments so small they might have been imagined if she had not been paying attention. Cameras remained ever watchful, but the sense of being constantly evaluated eased, replaced by an unspoken acknowledgement that she was no longer a volatile variable. Veda embraced this new equilibrium with unmistakable enthusiasm, sweeping Amy into a series of activities that ranged from shopping expeditions conducted with surgical precision to afternoon teas that doubled as lessons in family history and expectation. Through these moments, Amy began to understand that Veda's warmth was neither naive nor accidental, but a calculated form of cohesion that kept the family anchored through upheaval, binding loyalty with affection until the distinction between the two blurred into something durable. Dax, for his part, became a constant without becoming oppressive, his presence woven into her days with careful restraint that spoke of conscious effort rather than instinct. He did not demand her time, yet he was always available when she sought him, whether that meant quiet conversations over coffee in the early morning hours or measured walks through the gardens where he explained security redundancies with the same precision he applied to negotiations. In those explanations, she glimpsed the structure beneath the power, the logic that governed his decisions, and the cost of the vigilance he maintained without complaint. It was during these walks that she began to notice the man beneath the role, not because he revealed himself easily, but because familiarity eroded the edges of fear until curiosity took its place. He spoke sparingly of his past, yet when he did, the details were chosen with care, references to instability and loss offered without self-pity, as though acknowledging vulnerability was simply another strategic calculation. She listened without interruption, recognizing echoes of her own history in the restraint he described, the way control had become both shield and burden. Rune hovered at the periphery of these developments, commentary ever ready, his humor masking a sharp awareness of shifting dynamics. He offered Amy insights freely, whether about the family's internal politics or the external threats that had necessitated her containment in the first place. And through him she learned that the danger she represented had diminished significantly. Rival factions neutralized their leverage and negotiation rather than bloodshed. The knowledge brought relief, tinged with unease, because it suggested that her presence had accelerated resolutions she did not fully understand. As the threat receded, so too did the justification for her confinement, and Amy found herself grappling with the implications of that reality, because freedom loomed not as a dramatic release, but as an impending absence she was no longer certain she wanted to face alone. The estate had become familiar, its rhythms no longer alien, and within its walls she had discovered a version of herself that was less reactive, more deliberate, shaped by proximity to power without being consumed by it. Dax acknowledged the change one evening as they stood beneath the fading light of dusk, the air crisp with the promise of winter's end. "It's quieter," he observed, his gaze scanning the grounds as though confirming the absence of threat. "It won't stay that way forever," she replied. "No," he agreed, turning to her. "Nothing does." The admission carried weight, because it suggested foresight rather than fear, and in that moment, Amy realized that the future he envisioned was not one of static control, but of adaptation, a quality she had always prized in herself. When he reached for her hand, the gesture was unremarkable in its simplicity, yet profound in its implication, because it was neither possessive nor protective, but mutual. They did not speak of departure then, nor did they need to, because the understanding between them had matured beyond ultimatums and escape attempts, settling instead into a shared awareness that choice was returning, slowly but undeniably. That knowledge reshaped their interactions, infusing them with a gentler urgency that did not erase tension, but transformed it into something generative rather than destructive. By the time the new year approached, preparations for the estate's gala were already underway, the house abuzz with anticipation that felt less performative than celebratory, and as Amy stood amid the flurry of activity, she recognized that she was no longer an observer, but a participant whose presence carried weight and intention. The shift was complete, not because she had been absorbed into the family, but because she had asserted herself within it, reshaping the space she occupied until it reflected her agency rather than negated it. When she caught Dax watching her from across the room, his expression thoughtful and unguarded, she understood that whatever came next would be negotiated, not imposed, and that realization grounded her more securely than any promise of protection ever could. New Year's Eve arrived at the Lane estate, not with chaos, but with intention, because nothing in that house was ever left to chance, least of all an event meant to signal transition. The snow that had lingered stubbornly along the edges of the grounds finally softened into slush beneath steady-foot traffic, pathways cleared and relined with lights that glowed warmly against the darkening sky, while inside, the estate shifted once more into ceremonial mode, its rooms dressed for celebration rather than defense. Amy Ray stood before the mirror in her room, adjusting the fall of midnight blue fabric at her waist, the dress moving with her as if it had been designed specifically to reflect who she had become over the past weeks, rather than who she had been when she arrived. The mirror reflected a woman she recognized, though not without surprise, someone steadier in posture, clearer in gaze, and less inclined to shrink beneath scrutiny. The faint marks on her hands had faded, her ankle held firm beneath careful steps, and the quiet confidence settling into her bones felt earned rather than bestowed. When the knock came, she did not startle. Dax waited just outside, dressed with understated precision, his expression unreadable until his eyes met hers, at which point something unguarded surfaced, brief but unmistakable. He did not speak immediately, nor did he offer commentary, because some assessments did not require language, and after a moment he inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging not just her appearance, but the journey that had led them both to this point. "You're ready," he said finally. "So are you," she replied, noting the absence of tension in his posture, the way his presence filled the space without pressing against it. They entered the family room together, where music threaded softly through conversation and laughter, and for the first time since her arrival, Amy did not feel the need to catalog exits or calculate risk, because awareness no longer equated to fear. The gathering unfolded around them with effortless momentum, guests circulating through familiar clusters, glasses raised in quiet toasts, and Veda moving through it all with radiant satisfaction that bordered on triumph. "There you are!" Veda exclaimed, drawing Amy into a warm embrace that felt genuine rather than symbolic. "I was beginning to worry you would avoid your own celebration." "It's not my celebration," Amy protested lightly. Veda smiled knowingly. "Everything is yours tonight, darling. New beginnings deserve witnesses." As midnight approached, the estate hummed with anticipation that felt less like spectacle and more like collective breath held in unison, and when the final moments of the year began to tick away, Amy found herself standing beside Dax near the tall windows overlooking the grounds, fireworks already positioned beyond the perimeter, waiting for their cue. "Do you regret staying?" he asked quietly, his voice low enough to avoid intrusion, yet sincere enough to demand honesty. She considered the question carefully, because reflexive reassurance would have cheapened the answer. "I regret how it began," she said at last. "I don't regret how it became." He nodded once, absorbing the distinction without challenge. "When this ends," he said, not as a threat, but as a recognition of inevitability, "you will have a choice." "I already do," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. The countdown began, voices joining together, and as the final seconds fell away, the sky erupted in light, colors blooming against the dark with controlled brilliance, the explosions reflected in the glass and in the eyes of everyone gathered there. Cheers rose, glasses clinked, and in the midst of it all, Dax turned fully toward her, his expression stripped of calculation. "Stay," he said simply, not as command, but as invitation. She did not answer immediately because choices carried weight, and she had learned the cost of accepting them lightly. Instead, she reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his with deliberate intent, grounding the moment in action rather than declaration. "I will," she said, "on my terms." A smile touched his mouth, brief but genuine, as it should be. In the days that followed, the world beyond this state began to reassert itself, drawn back into focus by necessity rather than urgency. Amy contacted her firm under the parameters they had negotiated, framing her absence as a family emergency that required extended leave, a justification that raised questions but did not provoke alarm. When she reviewed documents remotely, her analysis sharper than ever, she recognized that distance had clarified her priorities, stripping away distractions she had once mistaken for ambition. One evening, as she sat with Dax in his office, the familiar weight of contracts and strategy spread between them. She found herself explaining a merger framework with the same precision she had always applied, only now with an awareness of how theory translated into lived power. He listened without interruption, then nodded. "You should lead this," he said. She blinked. "Lead what?" "The legitimate expansion," he replied calmly. "Oversight, structure, ethics." The word caught her attention, its inclusion deliberate. "You're serious?" "I don't invite chaos into my operations," he said. "You reduce it." She considered the offer not as temptation, but as alignment, weighing the implications with the care she applied to every decision that mattered. When she accepted, it was with clear parameters and explicit boundaries, because compromise no longer frightened her when it was freely chosen. Spring arrived gradually, melting the last of winter's hold on the estate, and with it came a sense of forward momentum that felt earned rather than imposed. The gardens bloomed, roses spared from pruning, as Veda supervised arrangements with theatrical delight, and plans took shape with the same intentionality that had guided everything else. The ceremony, when it came, was neither grandiose nor restrained, but precisely balanced between tradition and autonomy, vows exchanged beneath open sky, witnesses chosen for loyalty rather than spectacle. Amy stood rooted in certainty as she spoke, not because the future was guaranteed, but because it had been consciously selected. When the celebration concluded and quiet returned, she found herself once more at the window, the ground stretching out beneath fading light, the path that had once represented confinement now symbolizing continuity. Dax joined her, his presence familiar and unintrusive. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "every safety guide says to double-check the license plate." He huffed softly. And yet, she echoed, turning toward him with a smile that carried no irony. Some detours redefine the destination. He leaned in, resting his forehead against hers, the gesture unguarded. "Wrong car," he murmured. "Right choice," she replied.